Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Cove Podcast. I'm Captain Todd Lemper, your regular host. And today's episode is centered on integrating the reserves. It sounds like a lofty concept. We're going to go into a lot more of the tactical detail. But basically, it's going to describe the reserve workforce. It's going to talk about how to integrate reserves into ARA and then working together and what the pros and cons of each sort of workforce present. My co-host, and his voice will be familiar to you, is the creator of the incredibly popular Instagram page called Tuesday Night Violence Company, which is full of awesome content. He's already done an episode on equipment and gear selection, so go back and listen to that. His name's Corporal Mitchell Clark, and he's currently doing the training sergeant role at 2nd 17th Royal New South Wales Regiment. Welcome, Mitchell.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, awesome. I suppose before we go into the reserve workforce, and I want to talk about, so scope your experience, I suppose, first and frame where you come from. What's your background in reserve? I assume you've been a reservist the whole time and sort of for years and years and years, but what's your sort of background?
So I've had somewhat of a unorthodox career within reserve, starting off joining as a reservist in 2014, went through Kapuka, infantry IATs, and then in 2016, 2017, I went on Rifle Company Butterworth rotation, like the Christmas period for that. From there, came back, spent a bit more time in reserves. And at that stage in like late 2017, early 2018, that's when the regular army were offering year-long contracts to like high-performing reservists to kind of post to for a year to RAR battalions and subsequently deploy on operations to either Afghanistan or Iraq with them. So I went to 6 RAR in 2018, spent 2018 there, deployed to Iraq with them for 6 months and came back kind of middle of 2019. From there back to reserves, got called up. I was part of the call up for Operation Bushfire Assist, which is like the first time since I think it's World War II, where the reserves have actually been called up, not called for. So like you will parade at your depot at this time, at this location. So I was part of that end of 2019, early 2020. From there, 2021, I promoted to Lance Corporal and got a position on an Operation Resolute rotation, like part of the transit security element as a team leader. So that's, again, like a different operation than what I'm used to, than what I was used to at that stage. From there, promoted again to like full track, completed a few different courses. Like I'm a driver assessor for like 40 mic trucks, Mortarman, current CFA, and a few other kind of qualifications like that. So I've had quite an unorthodox career.
And it's varying level of different experiences and stuff. I don't want to take it back up to the lofty. So that's your experience and what frames some of the context behind what we're going to talk about today. I don't want to take it too high a level, but I think the DCA, when he talked about warrior culture, it was incredibly well received, the episode. But one of the things he mentioned was that professional armies start the wars and citizen armies finish them. It's actually a quote from the UK Chief of General Staff, General Patrick Sanders. But I suppose that's what the episode's centred on. If we know that, you know, the 1st Division will infill, we'll talk about the concept of employment with 1 Div and 2 Div in some subsequent episodes with some of the planners in both headquarters. But I suppose what we want to do is drill down between that integration between two different divisions and how they operate. I suppose what we first need to do, though, before we launch into that, is to define what the citizen army means. I suppose what is let's try to define that term, Mitch.
I think it's important to define what the citizen army term actually means, because that's different things to different people and it changes based on the time period. So for us, in its current form, that is the Army Reserve, or Choccos as they're often referred to as. For context here, Choccos was a term used to describe those personnel called up to defend Australia in New Guinea during World War II, like 2 years after the war had started and all the volunteers had well and truly left Australia for the war. And for whatever reason, that term morphed into what is now the Army Reserve as we know it. It's kind of a term that was originally meant in a derogatory way. However, it's almost seen as a term of endearment to those part-time soldiers, kind of the same as like the Rats of Tobruk was taken by the diggers. So we'll use the term Choco and reservist, part-time soldier interchangeably.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. So citizen army, now we'll extend that into part-time soldiers or reservists. So I suppose before we launch into that, what does the workforce look like, the current part-time workforce?
To understand the reserve workforce, I think we have to look at it in terms of demographics, maturity, experience, level of training would be a big one, and then motivation. And then we need to look at how they compare to the regular workforce through that same lens, and then consider the strengths and weaknesses of each workforce in order to understand how they can work together to achieve the purpose of ADF. So the first one would be like demographic and age. So most reserves are slightly older than ARA members. Average age of a digger in a RAR battalion is probably somewhere like 18 to 24 before they start getting rank. Sometimes you might have like a 24-year-old full track corporal. Average age of a digger in the Army Reserve, especially like my unit now, is around 25 to 40, right? So slightly older, slightly more mature. Reserves generally have an entire career, trade, degree, qualification outside of defence. So what does that mean? This means that in an ARES infantry platoon, you'll likely have a few cops, you'll have a few ambos, you'll have a few mechanics, you'll have teachers, builders, electricians, doctors, lawyers, a little bit of everything, right? And it's not just that, we've got people that work at Bunnings that can get us a discount. It's more than just those basic kind of jobs that everybody thinks of. We've got a massive amount of diversity in outside professions. So maybe 1/3 of reservists are also ex-ARA, so they also generally bring another level of experience from which the unit can draw from. I suppose the next one would be level of training. So reserves, unlike the ARA, have limited time to train. Surprise, surprise. We can't expect reserves to continually remain at the same level of readiness mainly as the ARA, nor is it reasonable to believe that they will be able to achieve the same level of training. I'm talking about like ATL levels, right? Within a year. They simply don't have the time to achieve this. Motivation this is a really interesting one. So let's look at this. So ARA rely on defence for their sole income. For that, they have to deal with the hardship of like posting locations, going out field for long periods, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, reserves devote their free time to defence. They don't have to deal with the hardships of posting around the country. However, they also give up a whole bunch of their free time. They have to uphold themselves to the same standards of like organisation. They give up a bunch of that time. There's no like us versus them. I suppose the way I look at it is that both have their hardships and both should be appreciated in their own respective ways. So that's motivation. They have very different types of motivation for being there, and you get different outcomes as a result.
I think that the best thing that epitomises this is that every time I record in a reserve depot or at a ARES battalion, it's always done in the boozer because it seems to be like the unit's sort of central hub. And they're always full of memorabilia and history from these units that have carried through Tobruk or certain, talking about Rabaul and the like. But there's so many different timber work and everyone comes in. I suppose they're volunteering their time to generate these amazing boozers, and you've got a multitude of different sort of technical trades and stuff coming in to help. You talked about Bunnings discounts, that's got to help as well. But I suppose is that the thing? The boozer is the pride of a reserve depot or unit.
Yeah, I suppose I look at, let's use my battalion as an example, like 2nd 17th Battalion. That was originally like an ARF battalion, right? I'm currently reading about like the Rats of Tobruk right now, and I'm kind of learning that our battalion motto, which is what we have, we hold, that came from Tobruk. And, that was like the first time that the Commonwealth forces decided like, hey, we're not going to run anymore. We're turning around, we're digging in, we're fighting. And like 2nd 17th Battalion was part of that. So when you look around the boozer, like if you look up on the wall, you'll see all the battle honours. There's a massive amount of history in these organisations. And I think a lot of the guys we have currently at the unit, we're like kind of custodians of that. And that's really important. So culture is it's a massive part of reserves. And I think a lot of ARA members that come to a reserve battalion are shocked when they first get here to firstly to see all the battle honours that they didn't know existed. And secondly, by the culture or kind of the depth of the culture. There's a lot of culture within these units and it's going strong.
And I think that volunteering your time to develop an amazing boozer and get around the history of this unit, it sounds like it sort of epitomises all the things you've spoken about. Sorry to interrupt your train of thought though. Can we come back to like the length of the career? So you talked about having older soldiers. I suppose if we come back to what distinguishes the reserve workforce from a length of career standpoint, can you go through that?
So to differentiate a reserve career versus a regular army career, the best way I like to look at it is like a marathon versus a sprint. So reserve service makes a long career within defence far more achievable, especially in a job like, say, infantry or a combat corps role where we have a relatively high percent or a moderate percent of people who, quote unquote, get broken before they're like 30, right? So it just makes that long career a little bit more achievable because you've got a little bit more time in between, like going out field and whatnot, a lot more control over like your personal PT schedule, your programming. So if you kind of look after yourselves in reserves, you've got a pretty reasonable chance of having a long career as long as you look after yourself. I suppose that the thing about reserves as well, coming back to like the career type aspect of it, is like the vast majority of NCOs within ARES have deployed somewhere on overseas operations at least once. A fair chunk of them have done like 2 to 3. And at most reserve units, you'll find at least like a handful of NCOs that have just been absolutely everywhere and are still like kicking strong in their reserve units. So like, I mean, my CSM's a pretty good example. He's been in like, maybe 20 years or so. And you wouldn't expect, like he's spent all of his time working as a reserve and just kind of doing a similar thing to what I did, right? Where like if a full-time battalion's deploying somewhere and there's spots, he would slot into that spot, go and deploy with them, do like, and that's like the pointy end of their job, right? And then go back to reserve service, keep kicking around, continue on with his career. Something comes up a few years later, off he goes. And he's been like, you see him on Anzac Day and you're like, wow, you've been like a lot of places. We also had, more interestingly, we had a Lance Corporal at my unit who's like only just gotten out, like end of last year. He was in for like, I don't know, 18, 19 years or something. And I suppose you look at that and you're like, Lance Corporal, he's only in for like 19 years. He's only a Lance Corporal and he's been in 19 years. Like, that's not right. Well, he was one of those guys, like he's been just a hard charger his whole career. He was like great on the tools. He was great at everything I ever saw him do. And same thing, he's been absolutely everywhere. Like every operation defense has done in the past, 15 years, he's done it. But he just was happy staying in reserves. And once he got to Lance Corporal, he was happy, like he gets to mentor the diggers a fair bit, but he didn't want to kind of push his career further than that. And I suppose there's two ways to look at that, right? You can look at that and you can say, well, it should be your responsibility to push up the ranks, to use your experience, like leverage your experience better. But
that's a hard sell with voluntary service, right, though, because he's volunteering his time.
Yeah, and that's, I suppose, the other side of it that I've kind of matured into understanding a little bit more. Like he was still just a Lance Corporal, but at the same time, he was also like quite high up in the police. He's done that. He has a family. He's got so many other things outside army. So who am I to say that like that's not good enough? Definitely not. He's been absolutely everywhere. Like if army could look at like bang for buck what they've got out of him in his career, I think they're doing pretty well.
Yeah. So it's obviously talked about a few people you've worked with then, like CSM is one of them, and then Lance Jack last year, and the wealth of experience on the tools and volunteering his time to be on the tools. If we come back a little bit, and I want to make it, can you just talk through your OBAT, right? So one of the sections you had, or use an example, whether current or in the past, just talk through what a section would look like from an ARES perspective.
So I suppose the best example I can give is the last section I commanded before I moved in my current position, right? So we'll go through each member and I'll just talk very quickly about who they are, what they do, what they bring to the table, and then we'll go from there. So obviously there's me, the Seco. I'm 32, teaching background, been in the Army 10 years. I did a 3-month RCB, 6 months tour of Iraq, 2 months on bushfire assist, 6 months as a team leader on Op Resolute. I'm a CFA, Mortarman, and a driver assessor. So my 2IC, he's 35 years old, diesel mechanic, 13 years in Army. He was cavalry before he joined infantry. We actually did IATs together. He was on that same RCB I did. He was in Afghanistan when I was in Iraq. He also did bushfire assist. He was also a team leader on an Op Resolute rotation. That's like a 6-month rotation, by the way. So he's a CFA. He's also a mortarman. One of the riflemen, he's 32. He's an electrician. He's just joined police. 9 years in, he was former Norforce, completed one of the Norforce like recce Resolute rotations. SCCC qualled, another mortarman, great with radios. One of the riflemen, 27, 6 years in, former RAR. He's a uni student currently, also sniper qualified and mortarman.
What's he studying at uni? Sorry, do you know?
Yeah, it's like architecture.
Oh, architecture.
Yeah.
Yep. So
Yeah. But yeah, great guy. Gunner, he's 32, so same age as me. Registered nurse, former British Army. I think he was like 6 years there. I don't know if he went overseas with them, but I believe he did somewhere. 4 to 5 years here. He was also a sniper over there and a mortarman over there as well. So also like dual spec qualified. The grenadier in the section, 26. He was a student. Don't remember what he was studying. He's like 8 years in. Another current CFA, another current SCCC. He was also an amateur MMA fighter. So like he's the second person I'm sending in on ACP scenarios. I'll send in like a little guy first just to draw them into the room. And then he's kind of a beast of an individual. And he's actually the nicest guy ever. So the last one, 30 years old, mechanic and 6 years in. So you can kind of see like the ages is kind of late 20s, early to mid 30s. And there's a range of different, I suppose, qualifications or skill sets there. You know, we've got like an electrician. We have two different types of mechanics. We have a registered nurse. Like most of the people within there have got a specialist qualification, like a whole bunch of mortarmen, 2 snipers, right? And I think, and also like most of the guys there have been on multiple operations, right? So I think you'd be pretty hard pressed to find like a current regular army section with that amount of experience, that amount of maturity and so many different qualifications. I'm not going to say it doesn't exist, but it's just, I suppose it's good to frame the depth of what reserves can actually bring to the table, because it's so easy to just pass them off as like, oh, it's just a section of Choccos, they wouldn't know anything. But when you actually go deep, it's like, hey, some of these guys actually know a lot. There's guys in that section that know a heap more than I do. And it's very, it provides army and defense with a lot of capability.
Yeah, and so we'll talk about that capability in a moment, but I want to just, so you talked about just qualifications as well, but we're talking about, like, say we extend that to languages. Maybe some of them have picked up a few languages and they have a different ethnicity, so they come from a different cultural background, so they have a cultural understanding. They also have, like, obviously they have hobbies, and you talked about MMA fighting, obviously, but there's some hobbies that we wouldn't have touched on that they have, and strengths and weaknesses, or just interest in certain things that they, like you talked about being a bit of a history buff and talking through Tobruk, but also the invasion of Ball and the like. I think if we talk about that, so coming back to your capability thing, how do we use that section in contrast to how we would use an ARA? Is it the same, or is it, what sort of pros and cons do they bring?
All right, so I suppose it's best to let's imagine like you send an ARES infantry platoon into an environment and you put an ARA infantry platoon next to them. Okay, let's say I'm talking about an environment with like different language, complex terrain, limited access to infrastructure, logistics, etc. So the ARES platoon is going to rely very heavily on the ARA platoon for up-to-date TTPs, SOP development. This is where the ARA call sign will excel, right? Because they're like current time on tools. Think of them as like a very precise tool. Meanwhile, at the same time, the ARA platoon will also find the reserve platoon very capable of solving those curveball problems, such as language barriers, dealing with locals, understanding infrastructure, maybe trying to fix infrastructure, get power or whatever, fixing vehicles when we don't have access to like recce mechs or something like that, or equipment, and doing all of this with like low access to logistics. I think that's where reserves really shine. And that reserve platoon it's not as precise of a tool, but it's more a jack of all trades. They offer diversity of problem solving, and in this way, both call signs will complement each other's weaknesses. I think that the ARA call sign will also be very surprised at how much experience a lot of these ARES guys actually bring to the table.
So now that we have a baseline understanding of, I suppose, your section and what the makeup is, talk to about level of training and motivation, volunteering their service, and then subsequently like the qualifications, relative strengths and weaknesses compared to the full-time force. So if we want to zoom out, back out again, how do the two forces interact at a more broader level? And to revisit the original quote, like how do citizen armies contribute to the fight?
I think this serves as a good segue back to the previous episode you did with Lieutenant Colonel Steve Young on, I think it was mobilising through history. Having an understanding of what the reserve workforce actually looks like at that individual level. I talk about the section, obviously, because I'm a corporal, so as a section commander, I'm speaking there. I think that helps us to understand what they have to offer in terms of a mobilisation in time of war. Traditionally, the reserve workforce exists in order to strengthen the regular workforce into an organisation that can actively regenerate itself in a meaningful scale in the event of war. So just as in the First World War and the Second World War, the professional full-time army is tiny compared to the demands of a larger scale, let's say a peer-on-peer conflict. And I think mobilising the reserve provides the regular army with a relatively quick solution for plugging manpower gaps, and also the means to prime the pump, that is regeneration of the force. So the regular army, they'll respond rapidly. They've got the 6 regular infantry battalions that currently exist, and within a relatively short space of time, they can be bolstered by the 13 or so part-time infantry battalions once those units have had a short period of time to kind of work up. And then from there, it's a case of regenerating through like recruitment and whatnot.
Yeah, you talked about 13 reserve infantry battalions, but what have you got on the books here at your unit?
Yes, I think right now, like we're relatively full. There's always like position numbers still available for recruiting and whatnot. I think we've got like kind of 350, 400 people.
I think that'll be surprising to know that like the battalion is 350, 400 strong.
Yeah, like we can put a lot of people on the in the field. Generally, when we go, like we do field exercises, you can expect kind of maybe half the guys there. But in a case of like going through the Orbat, calling up a reserve battalion, you're going to get a battalion.
Yeah. So sorry, go back to the workup point.
In my experience, that workup doesn't take as long as I think you'd expect. This is just from a corporal perspective, so take that with a grain of salt, as I can't really speak for like logistics, etc. But strictly in terms of training, we can get very capable quite quickly. For instance, like I've deployed with both full-time Orbats and reserve Orbats during my career thus far. And if I compare the capabilities of each at like the section level, once the workups or the pre-deployment training was completed, in my experience, you wouldn't really see a substantial difference between the kind of baseline capability between each at doing like our role, right? So like in the infantry space, maybe like at the battle group level and higher, you might, I can't speak for that because I don't work anywhere near that level. But at the section level, in my experience, both would be pretty well trained and pretty capable call signs on the ground.
And I think you talked about the term Choccos before, or like the origins of Choccos, but I think you talked about endearing, but also as a derogatory means of referring to the reserve workforce. Can you just like sort of zoom in your understanding of like the definition of Choccos, or why we're called Choccos, or you're called Choccos?
Well, let's kind of have a look at what the term Chocco actually meant, and I think it's important to review the current reserve workforce to see if the term still fits. Okay, so traditionally the definition of Choccos were 2 years into World War II, these people had not volunteered. They had to be forced into service. They had low to no motivation. They lacked morale. They lacked drive. They got very little training, and I suppose they were thought to melt in the heat of battle. That's why they were called chocolate soldiers, right? Chocolate soldiers. So if we zoom out from that, keep that in your mind, and now look at what our current reserves actually are. So they work full-time jobs. They spend their Tuesday nights training. So they'll go straight from work to reserves. They'll usually do that until late in the night, and then they get up early and work the next day. They give up a quarter or more of their weekends over a year. So I'm talking like a full work week, Monday to Friday, go straight to their reserve depots, get issued all their stuff out and go outfield. They'll get back, that'll be like Friday, Saturday, Sunday, going back to work on Monday and then doing a whole nother work week, right? So these are people that give up a whole chunk of their time to train, and they're paid well for their time, But we need to remember they're not reliant on reserves most of the time for the income. You definitely can be, and I think reserves is a really good kind of safety net for if you, if say for whatever reason you're made redundant in your civvy job or whatever. But the vast majority of reserves don't really do this for the income. They do it because they love it. So they're required to remain physically fit, but at the same time they're not given that like hour a day to train like you are in the regular army. They're still required to complete all the same like FPAT, ARN, admin requirements, the same as like ARA members, similar. But often they complete all this like extra admin in their own time. So if we revisit, the original term for Choco, and then we have a look at what the reserve force actually does now, do you think those two individuals are the same?
Yeah, it seems like to draw that argument out is completely false, I suppose, because we talk about volunteering, professionals volunteering their time to hone their skills, talk about limited work up to get a section into the field or into reinforcement. I don't think that really rings true.
But at the same time, let's not stop using that term because it's a term of endearment now and we love it. So yeah, I'm a Choco.
Yeah, cool. That's awesome. So yes, keep using the term Choccos. But I think if we talk about a limited time to train, there can't be you talked about maintaining ARN and mandatory training and all that sort of stuff. It's still there and they're doing it in their own time. But like if we have to argue that they can't quite get up to speed 100% with the TTPs and they have to volunteer their time, so that's a con. But what are the pros that the ARES force brings to the fight?
Well, I think that the so what of this is that reserve organisations have a limited amount of time to train. They can't be expected to achieve the same level of training outcomes in a training year as the regular army. It's just, it's physically impossible with the time on the tools. However, I believe they make up for some of that ground with like high levels of motivation. So they're keen to do their job. There's bang for buck training. So we don't have the luxury of like going out to, a training area and just sitting out there and waiting for like call sign after call sign to go through something. We have to figure out some other training because we've only got a certain amount of time. So they use their time very well. And I think reserves also bring a vast depth of experience, both in and out of defence, especially at that lower level, like private to corporal and sergeant type level. And I think they do a pretty good job at kind of making up for that where they can. They're never going to be able to fully make up for it, but they do a pretty good job at mitigating as much of that as they can.
Super interesting because like before we jumped onto the episode, you talked through an example of, something mechanical that went wrong in Iraq with an ARA, obviously being inserted into 6RAR, into an ARA section. I suppose, can you tell that story and subsequently I suppose try to envisage or sort of hypothesize what would have happened in that section if it was ARES?
Yeah, so the story I brought up was we were doing we did a lot of vehicle convoy type stuff over there. And we were doing a convoy. I think we were doing a recce of a training area or something. And we had an issue with one of the SUVs. I was in the actual car at the time when it happened. And it just kind of started violently rocking around. And so obviously the call sign stopped. We figured out that one of the wheels had kind of come off the hub. And we pretty much just needed to change a wheel, right? And we get there and us force protection went out and, we set up a cordon and whatnot to give some protection. And then all of a sudden they get to some of the diggers get to changing this wheel. And all of a sudden I'm just kind of looking in and I see that they don't know where the jack point is on the car. So all of a sudden they're starting to put this jack near the body of the car and they're struggling to find the tools and that. And I suppose this is not everybody. This is just a random example. But all of a sudden I kind of went in and tried to help them, and then all of a sudden it's me doing this the job for them because they didn't actually know how to change a wheel on a car. And that's through no fault of their own. Some of these guys were literally just kind of out of high school and straight into army, and here they are. That's no fault of their own. So what ended up happening is I changed the wheel for them and off we go, good to go. But I suppose I'll compare that with my experience working as part of a reserve formation on Operation Bushfire Assist, where we went, inserted into the local community at bushfire affected locations where we had to help out. A lot of the time we were just helping locals fix things, right? We were just doing general duties tasks. Now we would encounter every day we would encounter 5 different problems as a platoon, and within that platoon, as I said before, we have so many different trades and skill sets in that platoon. It'd be like, someone would come up and say, hey, this fence has gone down. Do you guys know how to build a fence? And we'll just look at the platoon, and one guy would from the back, hand up, oh yeah, I used to do that, or I do that now. And then all of a sudden, he gives us a quick soldier's 5 on how to, get it level and whatnot. And then we're like little ants. We're going and, rebuilding a fence. And then we go into the next place. And then someone's like, oh, I can't get the tractor working. And, someone else from the back of the platoon puts a hand up. And then all of a sudden, like, their tractor's working because, he's worked on tractors for like 10 years. And we would just go from like task to task to task. It's kind of like a bag of tricks. You've got so many different people that have so many different skill sets. And I think it's just something that I've been kind of blown away with in terms of like reserve service, that unfortunately the demographic of the regular army, they do have this, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of people in the regular army that have come from different backgrounds. This is just a trend. So the vast majority of reservists, nearly all of them, are still currently working in a trade or some sort of qualified position now, and the demographic for, especially at like the section level, like privates in the regular army, are usually a lot younger. So there's benefits to both.
I suppose that's the awesome positives. I suppose if we come back and take a little bit more of a pessimistic approach, let's look at the negative perception or misunderstandings that you've received from ARA organisations or throughout your time in the ARAs, and then switching between the two. Explain the more negative, or sort of maybe not negative, and sometimes we think it's perceived that certain people have opinions and stuff, but what's your experience?
Well, I think that the purpose of the points I've raised here, it's not really to put anyone down whatsoever. I like to work with like anyone I can. The purpose of these points is to kind of gain an understanding of what the reserve workforce at a section level and below actually looks like. The reason I bring it up is to kind of quell the dwelling myth of like Dad's Army, or, the original derogatory usage of the term Choccos.
Because, like you said before, you love the term. Like, keep using it because it's endearing.
Yeah, but I think the reason I'm here is to kind of give a little bit more depth to what reserves actually brings. If both the regular army and the reserve side of the army understand each other a little bit more and what each brings to the table, I think they'll work better in unison. Another point I think is worth calling out is the kind of tall poppy cultural issue that army has traditionally faced. And this is like every army worldwide, but I think it's worth at least talking about. And that is, I've done something you haven't done, therefore your opinion doesn't count. This is an age-old issue I've witnessed at like the private level and up at various stages throughout my time. And I think this issue stems as far back as like accounts of World War II diggers slanting Korea veterans like that's not a real trip, or Korea veterans then subsequently did it to Vietnam veterans. Then you've got like, Timor, Iraq, Afghan. And it's kind of all the way down to like courses. I've done a course you haven't done. And I've seen this rationale play out at most levels within small teams. And while I'd argue that defence they're currently making a heap of progress in terms of like the cultural shift away from this and more towards like lethality and professionalism and working with each other. I think it's definitely something worth mentioning at this stage, because once you see it and you actually analyse it, you'll find that it doesn't survive anything more than like face value. And a lot of people actively engage in this tactic that they're generally not even as close to as competent as they say they are, nor are they the type of people who are going to put defence in a position of professional growth. And I think that's very important when you're kind of framing where Choccos or reservists fit into the regs. It's very easy for each side to kind of slant each other. But if you at least you can identify that kind of cultural issue or trend when it appears, if you actually analyze it properly, it's pretty easy to kind of see through that. And something we spoke about off topic before is that we both agree that we think it's useless. It doesn't actually serve defence at all. So let's try to put a stop to it.
And that vanity doesn't last very long. DCA talked about World War I, 18 platoon, but it was a reference to a platoon commander recounting his observations on the battle space and being like, about a month in, the vanity of like fake bravado or like, large people, like this hero sort of vibe only lasted about a month, and then it started to come back to people who, like you said before and in your previous episodes, are seeking to understand other people's perspectives, getting really professional at what they do and understanding the bigger picture, and that we serve a broader organisation. That sort of vanity doesn't last very long.
Yeah, I think a classic example that you'll see is like Recon hates DFSW, who jointly hates SIGs, and then support company hates all the rifle companies, and then that battalion hates their sister battalion, and then that brigade hates all the other brigades, and then one div hates two div, and it's just like it's like a high school mentality. But I still see it, like it's a lot better than it used to be, but I still see it all the time, and I honestly genuinely don't understand it, and I don't think it serves us any purpose. I think it's just, as I said before, like anything past face value, and like it's so easy to quell that. It means nothing. At the end of the day, like we should all be working together. And that's what's going to increase lethality and increase our ability to do our job, regardless of like what corps you are, whether you're 1 div or 2 div, what your service category is, it doesn't matter. And that's the same as like we talk about like operational service. Yes, that gives you some experience in your job, but just because I've done X, Y, Z that you haven't done doesn't mean my opinion is any better than yours.
Yep. Do you see that same stuff in the ARES workforce, like with the us versus them, all that tall poppy stuff, comparing yourselves to others all the time?
Well, that's the interesting thing about the part-time workforce, that is because all of these people have an entire life outside defence, you rarely actually see this phenomenon. I'm not going to say it doesn't exist, but it's quite rare. Another example of this tall poppy kind of mentality is like you see it all like in popular culture, especially like popular male culture, is like the bro vets, right? These are like the people who spent a certain amount of time in defence. They might have been overseas a few times, and they get out, they have absolutely no idea what to do. So instead of forging a new identity, coming back to like reserves, having a different identity already outside defence, a lot of these guys, like their entire personality becomes trying to assert themselves as like that tall poppy, right? So cutting everybody else down to size. And a lot of effort here seems to go into like slagging the defence force, like i.e. soldiers are soft now. Back in my day, yeah, we're back on ops, we did X, Y, Z. When viewing not only different units, but also different service categories or different job roles, I believe it's important to be self-aware of this phenomenon. It can be pretty obstructive to like a joint force working together. And I will say that in my experience in reserves, it's almost non-existent, which is very refreshing.
That comment about the back in my day, Corporal Newman's, when we did a recruit instructor episode, he talked about, I think he definitely made it up, but he talked about pulling tablets out of the dust, Roman soldiers pulling tablets out of the dust, talking about how much easier the Roman soldiers today have it over when they had it. Do you know what I mean? So thousands of years people have been saying how hard it was back in my day. I suppose you touch on that point as well. Yeah,
well, I mean, if you look at like a Singo map, of the Singleton military area, and you look at the contour lines, I don't think the hills have actually changed very much, or if at all. It's an easy throwaway, and that's exactly what it is. So I suppose let's go back to the original point. So regardless of what opportunities you've been given during your career, regardless of how long you've been in, what the takeaway for me is, it's important to continue to be the best you can be for the good of the organisation, if not yourself. So do it for yourself, and also do it for the organisation. It's also important for the regular army to see the part-time force for what it is, which is a pool of trained and capable soldiers ready to bolster the army in time of need.
And that's absolutely awesome. I think when I did COVID assist down in Tasmania, and we had one of the infantry battalions attached to do some of the hotel quarantine. And I think had I have done this episode before that, I would have gone into that with a different mindset to be like, righto, like tell me about you, like who are you as individuals, rather than just putting them onto a, sync matrix as a picket. ask them what they can give you and all of the qualifications, interests, languages and all that sort of stuff, so that you build, like, you get really familiar with what the amazing things that a workforce can give to you. Thank you so much for your time today. That's, I suppose, a better understanding both at the section level but more broadly of the ARES workforce, or Choccos as you'd like to be known as. But thank you so much for your time, Mitchell. It's been absolutely awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.